done separately for different outcomes. So in that, if I was looking at an assessment that included cardiovascular or neurological outcomes, I would run through this process for the neurological outcomes separately for human and animals.
News Network.
But the first step,
it is June 12th, 2020.
Would you also look at different outcomes? So you look at endpoints would be neurological,
TSCA,
that's how I understand it.
EPA,
but then there could be
Fluoride
separate
legal
outcomes as well. So do you have to do this process for the individual outcomes
I've been
as well?
tuning in and trying to stream that.
Sometimes you might
the
roll
trial's
up
taking
a number
place
of
on
outcomes
Zoom because of
into one
pervasive
analysis.
virus.
So in the NTP
But
animal study, for
it's
example, there were
a group of
different
anti-fluoride activists who got together with Paul Connett's son, Michael Connett,
looking across
and are basically taking the EPA to task on their
that it may
complicity
be
with
inappropriate to roll them
the
up
fluoridation
and
program.
And but here
in a
we're
nutshell,
looking, we would have
they
applied
basically
this,
govern,
the learning and memory
they regulate,
studies of
the maximum
fluoride.
contaminant
But
levels
in the first step of the structure
variety
process,
of different
there would be an initial confidence
substances
based on
which
study design, considering
are
4
rated
factors,
for their
more of those
toxicological
factors that are
properties.
present
And
in a study design,
essentially what's
then the
happening is
stronger the causal
the
inferences
EPA
that can
sets
be
the
drawn
maximum
from that study.
contaminant level for drinking water.
And what is
and it's
NTP identified
higher
as the key study
than
design
what
features to
cities and counties
create an initial
administer
confidence level?
to the water
Controlled
itself.
exposure,
And of course,
exposure
if you've got
prior
any
to the
common
outcome,
sense, you know that
having individual outcome data,
any amount
and
of a
having a
neurotoxicant
comparison group.
is not something you would
And
want to
what
consume.
happens
So
after the initial
fluoride
confidence
is
rating
something we
is
talk a lot
determined?
about on the Zititic.news
then you begin to think about
cast,
factors that decrease your confidence looking across studies.
because it's such a
And
important
can you tell us what's the first property
public
considered for
health
decreasing confidence?
initiative,
Risk of bias, but at this
just
point we're
like
looking across
the
studies. So if you
gain of
remember that
function
we just looked
testing
at that colorful map
that was
with
done
pinks and reds
through
and
our public
greens,
health
so that would be across the body, having a sense of the bias
which
elements.
probably
If I
most
looked at a
probably
figure
led
like
to the
that,
release
and
of
it was
cerveza
mostly some
virus.
shade of green,
I'm being
I wouldn't have much
sarcastic, of
concern about
course,
risk of
using
bias
their
in my
Bernaysian
evidence.
doublethink
If I looked at that kind of
inverted
figure and there was a lot of
reality
pink and red,
terminology,
then I might have
such as
decreased
public
confidence
health,
in that
because it's,
body of
of course, fluoridation is
And what's
the
the second
antithesis of
property
public health.
considered for
It's
decreasing confidence?
doing the exact opposite of what
unexplained
it's purporting to do.
So now
It
you're
destroys
looking
your
across
teeth,
studies,
it destroys your
and it's very
bones, it
natural looking consistency
ossifies your
patterns.
ligaments,
If you find indications
it calcifies
of
your
inconsistency, then you want to see if
pineal
there's a
gland.
reason for it. Were there different
It
animal
blocks
models used? Were
iodine
there
from being
different test
absorbed in the
systems? Are
thyroid,
there
so
different
it
dose
affects
levels?
your thyroid,
And
which
so you might
affects your
identify
hormone
plausible reasons for the
production, which affects
inconsistency. And in
everything
that
else
case,
that's going on,
you wouldn't downgrade. But
including
if you
your
go through
immunity,
that process,
which is
and
pretty
it's
important in
unexplained,
these times,
there's
as people have
inconsistency, I don't know
discovered
why it's
with
there, then that would
cerveza virus.
decrease your confidence.
Anyways,
And what's the
this is a
third
very
property
important
considered for
pivotal
decreasing
trial
confidence?
because the
It's
EPA hasn't
indirectness.
really
So that's
been
where the collection
taken
of studies that
to
you
court
have
in
at
this
hand
context
are
and had
not
to
quite
defend
on target for your
the
question. So, for
science
example,
behind
if our question was learning and memory,
or lack
and let's say we
thereof
would have included
the
the
fluoridation
brain
policy
morphology
itself.
and
And
histology studies,
Michael
those would have
Connett
been
has
considered
gotten
indirect
together a lot of
indicators
experts
of an effect on
who
learning and
know
memory.
a great deal about this, having studied it,
And what's the next
some of them for
factor?
the EPA.
So
So it's a
now we're
fascinating
talking
window
about your
into the
estimates, your
state's
quantitative
attempt
estimates.
to
And typically
defend their
this is probed by
longstanding,
any
actually
estimate
they
that
claim
has to
it's
come
one of
with
their
confidence
top
limits.
10
And when
public
those
health
confidence limits are
achievements
very wide,
of the last
then it
20th
indicates
century.
that
And of course,
the
that's
real value could
absolutely
be
bogus. It's
sort of any number of values.
wrecked
And when
our
you look
health,
across your
and
body of evidence,
in my
if you have
opinion, it's
fairly
lowered the
narrow
IQ
confidence limits, then that gives you
of the
more confidence
group
that
population
you
by
have
such a
good
degree
grasp on what
that
the numerical
nobody
effect size is.
even
The
cares
imprecision would be if they're
to
wide,
know
they're very
about
varying,
the
then you may choose
fluoridation
to downgrade.
policy and what's
And
wrong
what's
with
the
it.
final consideration?
So they will never discover it as long as they continue to
findings of the
believe
study,
it, and it's
it
sort of
doesn't
circuitous
appear
that way.
in
But
the
anyways,
public domain.
that's
So
my
there's a few flavors of
my
this that are
intro.
pertinent to environmental health.
I'm
On
going
one
to
hand,
be tuning in
there's
and
the
out
idea
here,
that it may be an industry-conducted study and effects
maybe
were
jumping
found,
in and making
but it
comments if I
doesn't
hear
appear
anything.
in the
So
public domain. Another
yeah,
is, and
enjoy.
this is more really
I'm gonna
with
mute
journal
myself,
publication
and
models and more of the
you
academic
can listen
literature.
in on
It's,
the proceedings.
historically, it's harder to publish negative studies. So there's some concern that if there are negative findings, they're not appearing in published papers. Publication bias is very difficult to assess if it's present. So in the context of the structure framework that we're describing, you really wouldn't downgrade unless you had pretty clear indication that it was occurring, because it is so hard to assess.
Now, once you've considered all these factors for decreasing confidence, what's the next step?
And you think about factors that can increase your confidence.
And can you take us through those real quick? What's the first factor to consider?
So a large magnitude of effect, and this has to be considered in the context of the specific outcome. So what might be a large magnitude of effect for weight loss might be a very different analysis than what would be a large magnitude of effect on blood pressure. So it's very specific to the endpoint. In the context of an epidemiology study, we're talking about that the magnitude of effect is sufficiently large that it's not likely to have been accounted for by potential confounding factors.
What's the next property?
The dose response. Typically, this is the notion that as you have increasing dose, you have increasing incidence or severity of the adverse effect.
And the next factor?
Residual confounding. So this would be unaccounted for confounding, and this is a little tricky to explain, so bear with me. So what you've done at this point is through the risk of bias analysis, you have a sense of the confounding factors, and you maybe have a sense of the direction of bias toward the null, bias away from the null. So you consider that along with the pattern of findings, and sometimes that might give you increased confidence. So for example, if I have identified a number of confounding factors in my analysis, and their bias is toward the null, toward not finding anything, yet across my studies, I'm observing an association, it might give you more confidence that there's an association. The flip of that is that maybe if the biases are away from the null, toward finding something, but what I'm observing is no association, you might have more confidence in that no association.
And what's the next factor?
So consistency, and here we're talking about across animal models or species, across dissimilar populations, in particular human populations, across study design types. So if you're seeing the same signal coming from a variety of mechanisms, then it gives you more confidence.
Dr. Thayer, is it possible that you can have consistency across findings, but you would still choose not to increase confidence?
Yes. In particular, yes.
Can you explain that for the court?
Yeah. Yeah. So in particular, if there's a bias concern, so it's possible for, let's take our animal model approach. So let's say I see a consistent pattern of effect in my animal model, but none of the animal studies are randomized, and there was no blinding at outcome assessment. So there may be a sort of a very consistent pattern, but if you have a consistent underlying concern for the risk of bias, it may measure your acceptance of that consistent pattern.
And could the same be said for human studies? If there's a pattern of bias in the human studies, would that impact how you would increase confidence or whether you would increase confidence?
Yes, it could impact it.
In the pattern, to identify those patterns, you would identify that in the prior step where you consider risk of bias across the entire data set for each individual study. Is that right?
Yes.
And what is the other category?
So that's really assessment specific. So there may be other reasons why you increase your confidence. For example, if what you're observing is appearance of rare outcomes, which you would not have expected to detect statistically, that may be something that increases your confidence.
So what happens after consideration of the factors upgrading confidence is complete?
Then we think about characterizing our confidence in the body of evidence, everything from high to very low.
Dr. Thayer, were you involved in developing that methodology?
Yes.
And how was that methodology developed?
This was based on guidance from the GRADE working group. GRADE is grading recommendations, assessment, development, and evaluation. It's a widely used structure framework for reaching confidence or certainty evidence conclusions. It's used by over 100 organizations in 19 countries.
And what did NTP determine confidence ratings for the animal data?
Yes, they reached conclusion of low to moderate confidence in the evidence for an effect of fluoride on learning and memory in animals exposed in adulthood or during development.
And was there a specific threshold level that NTP based its results on?
Vague, ambiguous, overbroad.
You can answer that question. Overruled.
It was contextualized in the context of 0.7 parts per million. So contextualized in the context of what would be pertinent to water fluoridation.
Now, was NTP 2016 a dose response assessment?
No.
So why did NTP make conclusions contextualized to a specific dose?
To help inform the discussions that were occurring that are still occurring in terms of concern about water fluoridation.
Now, you mentioned that the NTP findings were low to moderate, and I'm wondering, why did you land on a range of confidence as opposed to, one confidence level or the other?
We had more confidence in the studies with adult exposure, in particular those that used the Morris water maze that presented a moderate level of evidence. And then our confidence was reduced in the animal studies that had developmental exposure.
And did NTP 2016 identify factors that somehow decreased confidence?
Directness and risk of bias.
And can you explain what was the concern for directness?
So with directness, so these are neurobehavioral studies. The animals have to move in order to perform the task. So, and this includes the analysis of learning and memory. And we saw some indications of effects on motor and sensory function in animals. And so we weren't able to completely tease apart whether some of the performance on the learning and memory could have been because there was an impact on motor and sensory function. So that was considered a form of indirectness.
And can you explain for the court your concern for risk of bias?
So this was really related to the developmental exposure studies. There was a failure to account for litter effects in many of the studies that had developmental exposure.
And Mr. Hamburg, can we bring up US Demonstrative 22? Dr. Thayer, are you familiar with this graphic?
Yes, this presents the risk of bias analysis and the studies looking at developmental exposure to fluoride. The issue I mentioned, the failure to account for litter effects, is reflected in were there any other potential threats to internal validity? So you see that here there's a sort of a dark yellow, which reflects a probably high risk of bias.
And Dr. Thayer, did NTP 2016 report a chart like this for each outcome test?
Yes.
And what's the next step of systematic review after rating the confidence in the body of evidence?
Then we begin to translate those confidence ratings into level of evidence of a health effect.
And can you explain for the court the significance of the descriptors on this next slide?
So these descriptors, one, sort of include your confidence judgment, as well as what was the nature of the finding, toward a health effect or no health effect. So if we look at on the left, sort of the darker blue inset panel, then you can see that it's in many cases a direct translation, high confidence in the body of evidence, high level of evidence for a health effect. Low confidence in the body of evidence, low level of evidence for a health effect. And then if there's very low or no evidence identified, then that becomes inadequate. But then on the right side, sort of the green inset, the conclusion here is no health effect. And because of the inherent challenges of demonstrating a negative, we would not reach a judgment of evidence of no health effect unless you were dealing with a body of evidence that you had very high confidence in. In all other circumstance, the evidence would be considered inadequate to reach a conclusion about no health effect.
And Dr. Thayer, do these descriptors, do they reflect causality?
Causality is embedded with them. The principles of Sir Austin Bradford Hill is part of the structured framework that we just walked through. Again, part of the NTP approach, part of the GRADE approach. It's also embedded within the Irish programs approach.
And can you just explain for the court, who is Sir Austin Bradford Hill?
A British epidemiologist and statistician who very famous for discovering the linkage between smoking and lung cancer, also developed a set of 9 considerations that have been very helpful in terms of structuring the process of reaching causal determinations. They're widely used in most structured frameworks.
So the Bradford Hill considerations are not specific to systematic review. Would you agree with that?
Correct. What systematic review does is takes these considerations and gives you more detail about how to operationalize them. So they're not just phrases, they come with more methodology for how to think about them. So that would be the difference between the considerations and what systematic review does with them.
Now, did NTP 2016 end up translating the confidence ratings into level of evidence of health effects?
Yes.
And what's the next step of systematic review after you reach a level of evidence conclusion?
Then you begin the process of integrating across your lines of evidence to develop hazard identification conclusions. So again, the process we've been discussing would be done separately for human studies and animal studies, but in hazard identification, you would bring those together.
And what's the purpose of this evidence? Well, you just described the purpose. What happens if one evidence stream, either human or animal, has no studies?
Then functionally it becomes low or inadequate in this matrix.
Now, hazard identification can be based on animal data alone. Is that correct?
Correct. And in fact, for many environmental chemicals, you don't have human evidence, or it's not suitable for hazards. So in many cases, the hazard identification is done just on animals. And then other cases like fluoride is sort of a less frequently, you have very large evidence bases where you have an abundance of human information, animal information, mechanistic information. So we have this for fluoride, we have this for arsenic, we have this for methyl mercury, but those tend to be more exceptions. And in those cases, the more human evidence you have, then oftentimes the hazard identification is really driven by that. And the animal information can help you contextualize or address some of the limitations that you might have in the human evidence for reaching causal conclusions. But then it's also possible that points can be reached where the conclusion of human hazard becomes settled. So for example, the Irish program is doing an analysis of methyl mercury. It's going to be focused exclusively on the human evidence. It's a known human neurotoxicant. The last reference dose that we developed was based on human evidence. There's no real value at this point for dose response analysis and looking at the animal data and the mechanistic data.
And did NTP 2016 reach a hazard conclusion?
No.
And did you, during your time working at NTP, did you ever learn of a plan for NTP to actually reach a hazard conclusion by exploring the human data as well?
Your Honor, at this point, I would just like to make clear that if EPA Council intends to open the door as to the NTP's draft monograph that plaintiffs intend to require.
Plaintiffs what?
Plaintiffs will, I would just advise, it sounds like Council may be opening the door to NTP's draft monograph, and that was a subject of a motion in limine. And if Council does, I believe plaintiffs will have the right to inquire into the draft finding.
Well, let's see where it takes us. Right? Go ahead, Ms. Corporal.
Dr. Thayer, during your time working at NTP, did you ever become aware of a plan for NTP to reach a hazard conclusion by conducting a formal systematic review of the human evidence and integrating it with NTP 2016?
Yes.
And to your knowledge, has NTP undertaken that?
Yes, a draft assessment was released last year and underwent external review.
And I'm sorry?
And underwent external peer review.
Do you have any knowledge of what organization peer reviewed the human systematic review?
National Academy of Sciences, or the NAS.
And do you have any knowledge of whether the National Academy of Sciences made recommendations back to NTP?
They did. There was a report. I'm not familiar with that report. I browsed through the executive summary, but I'm not very familiar with the report. But yes, a report was released.
And since the peer review published by the National Academy of Science, has NTP concluded or reached hazard identification conclusions based on an integration of the human and the animal data?
I'm sorry. Could you repeat the question one more time, Ms. Kapoor?
Sure. Since the National Academy of Sciences peer review report, has NTP concluded or reached final hazard conclusions with regard to fluoride exposure?
No.
Now, did NTP 2016 reach any other conclusions?
A number of conclusions about more additional research needs. So the suggestion is sort of about additional studies to probe the specificity of findings in terms of whether they were learning and memory specific, trying to tease out the impact of potential effects on motor and sensory function. Also, more research to try to clarify the effect sizes, and also more research to try to clarify the effects that might be happening at lower dose levels.
And are you aware if NTP ever took action to fill the data gaps that were identified by the 2016 systematic review?
Yes, and an animal experiment was conducted, yes.
And do you recall the name of the author or co-authors that conducted those experiments?
I believe the main author was Christopher McPherson, and then working with mentorship of Jean Harry.
Do you know Christopher McPherson personally?
No.
And do you know Jean Harry personally?
Yes, and she worked with me closely on the 2016 NTP report.
And if have you read the conclusions from the report that was done to fill the gaps?
Your Honor, at this point, I'll object to hearsay. This is a fact witness. She was not involved with the study. Counsel is now eliciting a court statement. Study that she was not involved.
Your Honor, I'm just asking her if she's aware of whether the study was done and completed.
Well, I don't think that was your last question. You already asked her whether the study was done, and she did and can testify to that. But I think you started to ask about conclusions. Maybe you should rephrase the question and we'll evaluate.
Sure. Dr. Thayer, did you read the final study?
Yes, a pretty quick read, but I did read it.
And is it true? What's the name of that study?
Your Honor, it's not, at this point, we're just dealing with here.
Let me just, I'll withdraw the question. I withdraw the question. Let me just say,
Go ahead.
I'm sorry, Your Honor. Dr. Thayer, if I refer to that study of McPherson 2018, will you know that that's what I'm referring to?
Yes.
Thank you. And were you involved in any discussions related to the design of McPherson 2018?
Yes.
And that was while you were still working at NTP, is that correct?
Correct.
And do you recall any discussions related to selection of the animal models?
Yes, there were discussions about what to use, a rat, a mouse. I think ultimately a decision was reached to use a rat model that's used in cognition study. There were also discussions about how to approach a study in terms of what sexes to look at. The issue is we saw some indications that maybe males were a bit more sensitive in the review, and we had that input. We also had a pragmatic challenge of the logistics of conducting the study that we wanted with males and females at the same time. So a decision was made to focus on the males since it seemed like they might have been more sensitive.
And Dr. Thayer, do you recall any discussions related to selection of which dose levels to use in that experiment?
Yes, there was a lot of discussion of that. So part of it is that we, again, one of the recommendations was to try to test lower exposure levels, but we had this challenge of being able to sort of design that in a way where the control group actually had no fluoride. So there's background levels in water that would have to be considered. There's also levels of fluoride in the animal diet. And so that was a challenge to think about how to design a low dose study. Ultimately, a decision was made to pick a 20 part per million dose level to help align with the published literature so that we could see if we could reproduce the effects that were being reported. And then a lower dose of 10 part per million was used. And the idea was that we would observe the findings, and then based on presumably identifying the more sensitive endpoints, additional analyses could be done to sort of better probe the lower dose range and also include females.
Thank you, Dr. Thayer. I'm going to transition now from once you've reached a hazard conclusion or a hazard confidence, what's the next phase in the IRIS assessment?
To do dose response analysis for the purposes of identifying, in this case, a toxicity value referred to as a reference dose that's considered protective of human health.
And is this when we begin to shift from hazard to risk?
Yes, the dose response is an input to characterizing risk.
And so when you're doing a dose response, you actually are characterizing the hazard then, and it's just an input for the next step, which is exposure. Is that accurate?
Overruled.
Yes. You're characterizing the hazard, and then you're trying to characterize at what dose or exposure levels they occur at. And then the risk is when you consider what people are actually exposed to.
And does the dose response assessment require systematic review, another systematic review?
No, it builds on the systematic review that was done to identify the hazard.
And how do you go about assessing the dose response? How does IRIS go about assessing a dose response?
So for something like neurotoxicity, it's assumed that there is a threshold dose response, which means there's some level of exposure that if you are exposed to a chemical, the body can adapt or adjust with it or deal with it so that there's no appearance of an adverse effect. But then as the dose increases, the body has less ability to deal with that stressor, and you begin to see manifestations of adversity. And then, so.
Dr. Thayer, are you familiar with a reference dose?
Yes.
What is the reference dose?
So it's an estimate of the daily oral exposure level to which the human population, including sensitive subgroups, can be exposed to for a lifetime that's thought without risk of deleterious effects.
And does the IRIS program identify reference doses as part of that, as part of their products?
Yes.
And how does the IRIS program go about defining a reference dose?
I think we have a schematic for this, or no?
Sure. Mr. Hamburg, can you bring up US Demonstrative number 27?
So there would be an analysis of the zone in the dose response that is around where we think a threshold is happening, with the purposes of identifying something referred to as a point of departure.
And can you define point of departure?
So it's a dose level that begins, it's the starting point for extrapolating to develop a reference dose. So a point of departure is identified, and then a series of factors to account for uncertainty and variability is applied to that point of departure to establish the reference dose.
Okay, now we could this is the threshold slide we're looking at. Can you explain for the court this population of varying reserve capacity and how he can see from the chart what that means?
Right, so this is the notion that at some level of exposure, the body is able to accommodate, to adapt to the exposure, and that would be, there's no expectation of an adverse effect, but as the dose goes up, you lose that reserve capacity, and that's where you begin to see the pink bubbles. And then also layered into that schematic is that at each exposure level, you expect that there's going to be variation in how a population responds. Some people will be more sensitive, some people will be less. So there's going to be variation of individual response.
So the point of departure, is it accurate to say the point of departure is a dose at which we begin to see a response?
It's the dose level where we begin the process of extrapolating to achieve a reference dose.
Can we have the next slide, please? Dr. Thayer, how does the IRIS program go about identifying this point of departure?
There are two basic methods. One is it can be estimated based on both benchmark dose analysis. Another is it can be based on administered doses, so doses that were actually administered in studies, and that's something referred to as a no AL or low AL approach.
Now, what is the benchmark dose approach?
So the benchmark dose approach starts with identifying a benchmark response, which is a predetermined change in response rate of an adverse effect. And then
Go ahead, Dr. Thayer, I'm sorry.
And then the benchmark dose is the calculated dose that produces that predetermined change.
So at this chart we're looking at here, be accurate to say that the benchmark dose is equal to the point on which the dose and the response meet on the dose response curve. Is that accurate?
Taken a big.
Maybe you can rephrase that.
On this chart, the BMD is equal to the point on which the BMR intersects with the dose response curve. Is that right?
Correct.
And can you explain for the court, what is the benchmark dose lower confidence level, or otherwise known as BMDL?
So that's the level that's typically chosen as a point of departure. So the benchmark dose is a numerical estimate, which means it has confidence limits around it, to bound it. It has a lower confidence limit and has an upper confidence limit. So the BMDL is chosen because you can see that it results in a smaller dose. So if you use that as the point of departure, then it's considered to be more public health protective than if you would use the upper bound.
And can you, is there a specific way that the benchmark dose level is calculated?
A variety of mathematical models are applied to a given dose response curve, and then from those they're evaluated for goodness of fit, and a model is selected. And so I should say that the benchmark dose approach is the preferred method by EPA, but there are circumstances where it can't be conducted. And in those cases, we would use the no AL or low AL approach.
And Mr. Hamburg, can we put up US demonstrative number 29? Can you explain, Dr. Thayer, exactly what this chart is?
At a high level. So what you're looking at here are two dose response curves, one for male rats and one for female rats. So this is animal data. And then for each of those, a variety of models is applied. And then a model is selected as being something, in this case, that's considered to be the best fit for the observed data. And it's through this process that a specific model is selected from a benchmark dose analysis. And you can see here that two different models were picked for the two different dose response curves.
So how do you reconcile which model to use ultimately?
It's an expert judgment. So I would not do this. In my group, in the Irish program, there's about 40 scientists, most of whom have PhDs, and they have specific areas of expertise: statistics, epidemiology, toxicology, pharmacokinetics. And we have a specific disciplinary work group of statisticians. And when we have a benchmark dose analysis that needs to be done, that group does it. That's what they do. And they have a process where it could be one person doing it, and it gets QC'd by another person. It could be that if you have a really complex scenario, multiple people are working on it and it gets QC'd, but we have a special group of people who do that. And that's just to develop the draft approach. And then in my division, prior to us releasing a draft outside of the division, it goes through a senior management review where we also have additional expertise on dose response analysis to review the work done by that expert group.
Dr. Thayer, are you aware of any IRIS assessment or BMD analysis that's been done on the back of a napkin?
No.
Now, Dr. Thayer, can you explain for the court what is a NOEL?
Should we go back to that schematic?
Oh yeah, if we can go back to US demonstrative number 28, please. Oh, it's there. You go.
So it's the highest administered dose at which no significant adverse effects are observed. And if the benchmark dose approach wasn't appropriate, then we would then try to find out whether or not the POD could be based on an OAL.
And what is a low AL?
That would be the lowest administered dose at which significant effects were observed. So that
is there a relationship on this dose response curve that we could help the court understand the distinction between the two?
So these are administered doses. So these were doses were actually used in the study. And that study may have administered doses and identified a dose level, the highest dose level where nothing was found. That would be the NOAL. They also may observe doses where adverse effects were observed. The lowest administered dose at which significant adverse effects were observed would be the low AL. And if we were using the no AL or low AL approach for a point of departure, we would prefer to have a no AL. But it's possible that in a given experimental study, that there is no dose level at which no observed effects were observed. It may only have low ALs.
Can you clear this slide, Mr. Hamburg, please? Dr. Thayer, you mentioned earlier that the IRIS program prefers the benchmark dose response over the no-AL approach. Can you explain that for the court?
Right, so again, the no-AL, low-AL approach, you're constrained to the actual doses that were used in a study. So you can't speak to, there could be issues with the spacing. How far apart are those dose levels? The no-AL, low-AL approach does not take advantage of any information about the shape of the dose response, whereas the benchmark dose approach does.
Dr. Thayer, once the point of departure is established, how does IRIS then derive a reference dose from the point of departure?
By applying a series of factors to account for variability and uncertainty.
And what are those uncertainty factors?
So there would be one. Go ahead.
Mr. Hamburg, can you please put up US demonstrative 29, I think? It's 30.
So there's one to account for extrapolating from animal to human, another to account for human variability, another to account for subchronic to chronic extrapolation, low AL to no AL extrapolation, and if there's deficiencies in the database, in terms of it may not have enough toxicity studies to give you reassurance that many of the concerns, the health concerns that we think about would have been assessed.
Dr. Thayer, does the IRIS program apply all 5 of these uncertainty factors as a matter of default?
It explicitly considers each of them. The actual numeric value applied could be 1, which means it was considered, but it actually has no functional significance on the dose level. Default would be 10, but it's possible in some cases that you may have some information to use something different than a 10, but not enough to go to a 1, and so a 3 may be applied. But if you consider all these factors, and if it's 10 for each of them, then you're reaching a point where there's so much uncertainty in the evidence base that it's unlikely that a reference value would be derived.
And Dr. Thayer, does the IRIS program have a preference in terms of the most relevant data stream for deriving RFDs?
Humans would be the preference. And you can see that here, animal to human extrapolation, if you had human evidence, then you wouldn't even need that factor. If your dose response is based on human evidence.
And what if you had human evidence that was based directly on the susceptible subpopulation? Would you need to apply any of these additional uncertainty factors then?
Overbroad.
Overruled.
So database deficiencies is an area where you begin to explore whether you have enough information to characterize concern for developmental exposures. And so if you had nothing there, then that would be a place where you might apply a database deficiency factor. But if you have information on your most vulnerable population, then that may mitigate the need to apply an uncertainty factor.
Dr. Thayer, what happens once the IRIS program completes the hazard assessment and the dose response piece?
We produce toxicity assessments, which convey these toxicity values, for example, reference doses, and they get used by program offices as well as states, other federal agencies, other international bodies.
Dr. Thayer, where your responsibility is in the NTP program and directing the IRIS program, do you interact with the scientific community on a regular basis?
Yes.
Do you interact with scientific regulatory agencies?
Yes.
And do you interact with non-scientific groups that are not connected to regulatory agencies?
Yes.
And do you keep up with the current state of the science for addressing questions related to environmental health?
Yes.
And are you aware of any existing methodology for addressing questions related to environmental health that is more current than systematic review?
No.
And based on your interaction with the scientific community, is the NTP's Office of Health Assessment and Translation well regarded for advancing scientific methodologies for supporting evidence-based decision-making?
Yes.
And based on your interaction with the scientific community, is the IRIS program well regarded for advancing scientific methodologies for supporting evidence-based decision-making?
I think so, and I think we have the 2018 NAS report to back that up.
And is systematic review intended to replace the scientific judgment of the reviewer?
Absolutely not. So the systematic review process is designed to make more transparent those expert judgments.
And are you aware of any existing methodology other than systematic review that is more relevant for addressing questions related to human health, environmental health?
Overruled, you can answer the question.
No, especially when coupled, in my case, coupled with consideration of EPA guidance and other materials.
Thank you, Dr. Thayer. I have no more questions for you, but I expect Mr. Connett will have some questions.
All right, we should take a break at this point. So why don't we take our 15-minute break and then resume with cross-examination.
Thank you, Your Honor.
Thank you.
Court is in recess.
The recording has stopped.
Hi, Dr. Thayer. This is the court reporter. If I could ask you if you could slow down a little bit in your testimony, that would be very helpful.
Okay. Sorry about that. I always talk fast.
Thank you.
Hey everyone, we will be going back on the record shortly. Judge, shall we resume, Your Honor?
All right.
This meeting is being recorded.
Please come to order. Court is now back in session.
Mr. Conant?
Thank you, Your Honor. Good afternoon, Dr. Thayer.
Hi.
So I take it before today's testimony, you had an opportunity to meet with counsel. Is that correct?
Correct.
And counsel went over with you some of the questions they were going to ask you, correct?
Correct.
Now, Dr. Thayer, when was the EPA formed?
Objection Foundation.
Well, let me ask you, Dr. Thayer, are you aware that the EPA was formed in the early 1970s?
Yes.
What year? You talked today about the systematic review methods that are being developed. The existence of OHAD and NAS is looking at these methods. I want to ask you, what year, Dr. Thayer, did EPA complete its first risk assessment that uses the systematic review method you have outlined today for the court?
So let's see. So we have, within the Irish program, we have drafts under development. We do not have finalized IRIS assessments that use the full systematic review. Across EPA, we also have TSCA assessments in draft format that use their systematic review methods.
Understood. So I'm talking about a complete risk assessment. Is there, as we sit here today in 2020, a completed risk assessment that EPA has ever done which uses the methods that you've outlined for the court today?
No. And in fact, as part of that NRC engagement dating back from 2011, it was made explicitly clear that we should not stop producing assessments until it was fully developed, systematic review process.
So prior to beginning risk assessments or attempting risk assessments that use the methods that you have outlined today for the court, EPA's risk assessments have used what's called narrative review. Is that correct?
Correct. Objection to scope. It's too broad in terms of just referring to EPA. And Dr. Thayer's testified as to just one program that she directs.
Your Honor, I believe the witness today has been testifying rather broadly.
Yep, objection overruled.
So, Dr. Thayer, as we sit here today, in June of 2020, virtually every federal environmental regulation now in place in this country is based on risk assessments that did not use systematic review, correct?
Correct.
And these regulations have served for up to over 40 years to protect the health of Americans, correct?
Objection, Your Honor. Dr. Thayer is director of the IRIS program. She testified that that program does not regulate. And we were very specific in our direct examination about the IRIS program and the NTP OHAT program. And so I object again to the scope of Mr. Conant directing his questions to the entirety of EPA.
She can testify as to what her based on her knowledge, overruled to the extent she can.
I'm sorry, can you repeat the question?
Do you believe, and maybe you don't, but do you believe that the environmental regulations that the EPA has passed for over 40 years have served to protect the health of
I like to hope so, but I'm not obviously familiar with all of the specific assessments.
Well, are you here today, Dr. Thayer, to say that we should eliminate every single federal environmental regulation that exists because they are not based on risk assessments that use systematic review?
No, I would never maintain that. I would argue that in terms of looking at the rigor of an existing assessment, what I would look at is the rigor of the external review. So you can have not done a systematic review, but if there's a public comment process, if there's a rigorous external review, then that increases your confidence in using that assessment. So I would say that you don't want to duplicate analyses, rigorous analyses that have been done in the past, but that's not quite the same thing that if I saw a journal publication that had a review, that I would feel comfortable skipping over the systematic review if I was going to do an assessment of that topic.
Now, the narrative reviews that form the basis of the regulations that exist today, or weight of the evidence analyses that relied on expert judgment to assess the best available science. Would that be a generally fair summary?
Correct, but if they would have been done, to my knowledge, in the regulatory setting, then they would have included public comment, external public review. So it would have been a sort of a very rigorous external review of those assessments, even if they weren't systematic.
And as I think you mentioned earlier, systematic review does not eliminate exercise. I'll ask the question. Systematic review does not eliminate the exercise.
Correct.
So systematic review is not like a computer where you insert data into a 1,000-page table and it spits an answer back out.
That's correct. I think that would frighten people.
Now, is there room for practicality in systematic review?
Yes.
And are you aware that in EPA Section 6 risk evaluations under TSCA, that EPA has taken what it calls a pragmatic approach to systematic review?
I've heard that.
And EPA has stated under Section 6 that it will maximize the scientific and analytical efforts of other regulatory and non-regulatory agencies by accepting, for the most part, the relevant scientific knowledge gathered and analyzed by others.
Objection is to form. I mean, EPA didn't say anything in Section 6.
Right. Maybe you should point to the actual language and show it to the witness. If that's what you want.
Because this is not something I'm familiar with.
Okay. Yeah, Your Honor, I will, if I could, show the witness the NMP risk evaluation that was introduced earlier this morning.
Okay, it was already shown.
Yes.
And what exhibit is this?
Your Honor, this is a plaintiff's exhibit 47. Oh, sorry, Your Honor. I meant I have the wrong risk evaluation. It should be. That's the NMP risk evaluation. Dr. Thayer, can you see the document on the screen?
Yes.
So I'm going to start here at the bottom of the page 47, and I'm going to move on to it says here, using this pragmatic approach, maximize the scientific and analytical efforts of other regulatory and non-regulatory agencies by accepting, for the most part, the relevant scientific knowledge gathered and analyzed by others, except for influential information sources that may impact the weight of scientific evidence underlying EPA's risk findings. And I'll stop there, Dr. Thayer, and ask you, would you agree that this is a sensible approach to take, a pragmatic approach to systematic review?
Objection to the extent it calls for expert testimony.
Overruled within her experience.
I can agree that those are the words that are written there, but I don't have any knowledge about how those concepts were actually applied in this assessment.
Well, fair. I understand that, but however EPA may have applied it to that risk evaluation, do you think this approach to risk assessment makes sense for EPA to do today?
Objection foundation.
Overruled.
Yes, and yes.
Now, in 2017, the National Academy of Sciences actually made a similar recommendation, correct?
Can you be more specific?
Yes, I'm thinking of the 2017 report by the NAS, which discussed the application of systematic review methods in the specific context of endocrine disrupting chemicals. And you're familiar with that report, correct?
I've read that report. Not familiar with the text that you're talking about. I'm sure it exists in that report, but it's not in my mind right now.
Well, I'll be more specific, and I appreciate it's a long report, and I'm sure you don't memorize every statement in that report. But in the 2017 NAS report, the NAS recommended to EPA that, quote, it would be advantageous. No, sorry, I'll strike that.
Objection to hearsay.
Sorry, Your Honor.
Hold on. Sustain.
I apologize. I didn't mean to. In the NAS report, Dr. Thayer, do you recall the NAS making any recommendations to EPA about building upon existing systematic reviews when doing a new systematic review?
Yes.
And so NAS basically was recommending to EPA hey, you don't have to reinvent the wheel. You can work from and build from prior existing systematic reviews. Would that be a fair summary?
Yes.
And EPA agrees with this approach, correct?
Certainly the Irish program agrees with that approach.
And what ultimately is, Dr. Thayer, the greater priority for the EPA? To protect human health from urgent chemical hazards, or to spend potentially years completing methodologically superior systematic review?
Do I have to answer that one?
I'm not sure I understand that, and that sort of, in many ways, poses a false choice. So I don't think that's a fair question.
Understood. Now, with respect to BMDL, you were asked some questions about that earlier. Dr. Thayer, would you agree that where you are able to identify the BMD as being within the field of observation, that will generally give you greater confidence in the BMD?
Because you're not extrapolating beyond the observed data.
Yes.
Yes.
Now, you talked about the peer review process that BMDL analyses undergo at EPA. I took from your testimony that because BMDL is a very technical exercise, that the people involved with quality control of that work product are generally themselves highly specialized in. Is that a fair summary of your testimony on that point?
Yes.
So can we gather from that sort of a more high-level risk manager who doesn't have a background in BMD or BMDL would not be the type of person reviewing the validity, accuracy of a BMD?
Obviously, it depends on the background of that risk manager. I would say that the expectation would be that that person probably understands the principles, EPA guidance with respect to BMDL, but that may be a different level of knowledge than somebody's actually doing the analysis, selecting the best fit model from a group of models.
I'm sorry, Your Honor. Ms. Kapoor, could I ask you to mute? I'm getting a lot of feedback, and I think it's coming from your feed.
I'm actually on mute.
Are you still getting the feedback?
All right.
Almost sounds like a radio or something. Is that like music or something playing?
Yeah, something.
Is that you, Dr. Thayer? Is that your phone ringing?
It was my daughter, but she stopped now.
All right, that explains it.
But she's not calling now. So if you're still hearing it, it's not that. I don't hear anything though.
I don't either. Are you still a court reporter?
No, it's better now. Thank you, Judge.
All right, thank you.
And lastly, just a question of definition. You were asked a question about the definition of risk assessment. I wanted to follow up on that. Dr. Thayer, you are familiar with the National Research Council's 1994 book on risk assessment titled Science and Judgment in Risk Assessment, correct?
Mm-hmm.
That is an authority in the field of risk assessment.
Mm-hmm.
Is that a yes?
Yes.
And in that document, Dr. Thayer, the NRC defines risk assessment as not necessarily encompassing all 4 steps of risk assessment, correct?
Be a little bit more specific.
Well, in that 1994 document, the NRC stated that risk assessment sometimes only consists of a hazard assessment designed to evaluate the potential of a substance to cause human health.
It's been a while since I looked at that. I will accept it.
Well, Your Honor, permission to refresh the witness's recollection.
All right.
And Dr. Thayer, can you see the screen here?
Yes.
This is page 27 of the NRC's 1994 book. And this is sometimes referred to as the Blue Book.
Mm-hmm.
And the NRC stated here that not every risk assessment encompasses all 4 steps. Risk assessment sometimes consists only of a hazard assessment designed to evaluate the potential of a substance to cause human health effects. Is that correctly?
You read that correctly.
You would agree with that, right?
Well, currently I'm speaking from the perspective of what the IRIS assessments do. So in the constraints of how I conduct assessments now, right, then it's really the hazard and the dose response analysis. I do believe that there may be other entities that conduct risk assessment in the way that we just read.
Your Honor, at this time I have no further.
All right, any redirect?
I have one question. Dr. Thayer, have there been published toxicological reviews that include parts of the risk, about the systematic review process that we described here today?
Yes.
So Your Honor, it was just unclear to me in terms of what time frame, who, vague and ambiguous, I guess.
Well, why don't you be a little more specific about which toxicological reviews, or what time period?
Well, Your Honor, I'm trying to rebut evidence that in the last 40 years since EPA existed, that, EPA in regulating hasn't used systematic review up till recently. And so I'm rebutting the broadness of the question, but if it's, specific to Dr. Thayer, during your time at IRIS since 2017, has the IRIS program published toxicological reviews that include parts or portions of the systematic review process that you discussed here today?
Yes, in August 2018, the RDX assessment included aspects of systematic review.
Was there also a risk assessment that was done in 2016 that included some parts or portions of the systematic review process that you discussed here today?
Yes, there were 2 reports.
Thank you. I have no more questions.
One quick follow-up, Your Honor.
Okay.
So just to be clear, Dr. Thayer, you've been at IRIS for over 3 years, is that correct?
Correct.
And during your 3 years at IRIS, IRIS has published 1 completed toxicological assessment, correct?
Mm-hmm.
And in that 1 completed toxicological assessment during the 3+ years of your time at IRIS, it used some parts of systematic review, but not all parts of systematic review, correct?
That's correct.
That's correct.
It'd be helpful for me to know what, in that 1 assessment, what parts of systematic review were used?
More clarity on how the studies were identified from the search, more clarity in the screening decisions, include, exclude, more clarity in how the studies were evaluated for quality. But the look and feel of that latter part would be different than what we're deploying today. They would have been less developed in terms of use of structured frameworks to reach confidence conclusions in the evidence.
So the call them pillars, but those principles were applied, but not in the same way they'd be applied under systematic review.
Yes, and again, it's really probably more, I doubt the expert judgments would change. It would be the look and feel of how they were communicated that would change. I realize that these are not finalized, but the IRIS program, pretty much everything that we've started since 2017 has full systematic review, and we have published protocols of those methods that have been out there.
And the one that was completed, did it use the predefined criteria? Were they predefined, or were they sort of explained what was included, what was excluded, the weight given?
Predefined. And I'm referencing the RDX one because that's the one that was finalized after I came to EPA. The 2016 assessments, I'm not as familiar with those.
Okay.
So in terms of how predefined those inclusion-exclusion criteria were in the 2016.
And I take it that's a major aspect of systematic review. Prior to the advent of systematic review, that was one thing that was sort of missing from the normal risk assessment is this pre-definition. Was that typical? Am I right to assume that was sort of typical?
Yes, and having, I think, the clear inclusion-exclusion criteria, and then being able to communicate at the level of, we screen this many studies, this many were excluded, this many were excluded. So those sort of reporting features would be what we expect now, and they might not appear in prior assessments.
Okay, thank you. Anything else? Any other questions, council?
Nothing from EPA.
Right. All right. Thank you, Dr. Thayer. You are excused. Appreciate your time and your attendance.
All right. Have a good weekend.
Thank you. You too. All right. Defendants may call this next witness.
EPA calls Dr. Joyce Suji.
Okay.
Dr. Suji, if you could raise your hand.
Great. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you. Angie, if you could administer the oath, please.
Yes. Do you solemnly swear or affirm that the testimony you are about to give in the matter now pending before this court shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God, or so shall you affirm?
Yes, I do.
Thank you.
Judge, may I proceed?
Yes, you may. Thank you.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Dr. Suji.
Good afternoon.
What are your qualifications as they pertain to this case?
I'm a toxicologist, and I have a PhD focused in environmental physiology with a postdoc in quantitative genetics. Since 1992, I've been certified by the American Board of Toxicology continuously. And in 2007, I was admitted as a fellow of the Academy of Toxicological Sciences.
Dr. Suji, what is the study of toxicology?
Toxicology is the study of the effects of chemicals depending on the nature and magnitude of their exposures or doses and individual conditions.
Where are you employed?
I'm employed with Exponent.
What kind of clients have you helped throughout your career?
I have worked for industry, government, including EPA, non-governmental, nonprofit organizations, and private citizens.
Have you published any studies on fluoride, Dr. Suji?
I haven't done any testing of fluoride toxicity, but I have reviewed the fluoride literature as part of a committee in 2008, 2009 with Dr. Thiessen on that included fluoride. And I have consulted on health effects of fluoride in drinking water at mining sites and in communities with semiconductor industries emitting hydrogen fluoride.
What is the committee that you just mentioned? Is there a name for that committee?
It was the National Academy of Sciences Committee.
Now, why should the court? Go ahead, please explain.
It was to, I think Dr. Thiessen described it. It was to come up with review of the toxicology literature, as well as derive health-based limits for air in submarines.
And why should the court listen to your opinion today regarding fluoride?
Well, I have 30 years of experience on a wide variety of projects, including and research, including investigating the neurotoxicity of metals and other chemicals. I'm often asked to serve on expert committees for the National Academy of Sciences and other organizations that are sponsored by EPA, NASA, the DoD, FDA, and other groups such as Komen for the Cure. I have also, as part of my committee work and as part of my publications, I have conducted systematic reviews of chemical effects. And for this case, I conducted a systematic review of the animal neurotoxicity literature on fluoride.
Dr. Tsuji, you prepared and signed a trial declaration summarizing the opinions you're offering in this case. Is that correct?
Yes, that's true.
Your Honor, may I show the witness her trial declaration, ECF number 199?
Any objection?
No, Your Honor.
You may.
Mr. Hamburg, could you please show U71? Dr. Tsuji, can you see this first page of your trial declaration?
Yes.
You recognize this as the declaration you submitted in this case?
Yes, I do.
Mr. Hamburg, could you please show the witness page 39? Dr. Tsuji, is this your signature?
Yes, it is.
Your Honor, I move to admit Dr. Tsuji's trial declaration into evidence.
No objection, Your Honor.
All right, so admitted.
Dr. Tsuji, if you could please explain, what were you asked to do in this case?
I was asked to provide an expert toxicology opinion on the potential for neurotoxicity of fluoride at the community water exposure level of 0.7 milligram per liter. I was also asked to respond to plaintiff experts' opinions regarding specifically the experimental animal data, which were alleged to show support neurotoxicity in humans at the community water fluoridation level.
Could you please summarize for the court what you did to respond to those requests?
Yes, I looked at the literature and found that the 2016 NTP systematic review was the most complete summary of the literature at that time. And therefore, I used that as a starting point and then updated the literature up to 2019 when I conducted my work, using their criteria to search the literature in PubMed, National Library of Medicine, using their predefined search criteria, as well as using their criteria for evaluating studies for inclusion and also for risk of bias and essentially evaluating study quality.
You said the NTP, is that the National Toxicology Program?
Yes, that's true.
Are you familiar with that agency?
Yes.
Is that a reputable organization, in your opinion?
Yes, very much so in toxicology.
Now, Dr. Tsuji, did you, in updating NTP's systematic review, did you conduct yourself a systematic review of more recent studies published since NTP's systematic review?
Yes, I used the systematic review methods.
And why did you use those methods?
Well, in this case, I found that the plaintiff's experts did not use systematic review methods. They appear to be basing their conclusions on the number of studies that found positive results using more narrative review, but not even evaluating the quality of the individual studies.
In your declaration, you described that you conducted a critical analysis of the toxicological studies of effects on learning and memory. Is that correct?
Yes, that was the focus.
And could you please summarize for the court what your critical analysis of those studies showed?
Well, overall, it was a very surprising finding to see that most of the vast majority of the literature is of very poor quality. I've never seen such a chemical with such quantity of poor quality studies. And I think because of this, NTP in 2016, who identified a lot of these issues even then, designed their own study and then published that in 2018, specifically to address a lot of the poor quality issues of the other studies. So my findings were that even with the additional literature, and certainly with NTP's study results, the animal literature are inadequate to inform us on conclusions of alleged risks of fluoride neurotoxicity at 0.7 milligram per liter.
And you testified earlier that you also considered the opinions offered by Doctors Thiessen and Grandjean in this case. Did your critical analysis lead you to develop any opinions with respect to their work?
Yes, their work appeared to be based on the quantity of studies with positive results. I think Dr. Thiessen was very struck by the number of positive cross-sectional studies. It seemed like because they were positive, that must mean they're all true. For the animal studies, similarly, she seemed to have very little knowledge of the problems with these studies, and none of that was reflected in her reports.
Now let's shift focus to, well, let's focus on the National Toxicology Program's 2016 systematic review. Could you summarize, Dr. Tsuji, what that review concluded? What the National Toxicology Program concluded from that review?
So from their review, they concluded that very few studies had been conducted at relevant water exposure levels for the 0.7 milligram per liter community fluoridation level. Also, that they were very concerned about serious risk of bias issues in these studies because of the poor methodology and the inability of the methods and the tests used to really conclude whether the effects were really caused by direct effects on learning and memory or other confounding factors or other systems. And thirdly, they concluded that the studies were, the overall evidence in animals was insufficient to inform us on the magnitude effects or even points of departure for risk assessment.
In your experience, have you seen any other chemicals that had the extent of bias that the NTP identified in its systematic review?
No, it's quite unique.
Did plaintiffs' experts, Doctors Thiessen or Grandjean, acknowledge the unusual nature of the toxicology literature on fluoride?
Overbroad.
I certainly didn't hear them discuss anything about the poor quality of the studies to any extent. I think Dr. Thiessen did acknowledge that the studies had deficiencies, but there seemed to be no effect of synthesis of that evidence or what it might mean.
Your Honor, may I show the witness Exhibit C from her declaration?
Any objection?
Counsel, what is Exhibit C? Could you remind me?
It's in evidence. It's from Dr. Tsuji's trial declaration.
Yeah, what is it?
The table of the recent developmental animal toxicology studies.
No objection.
Okay.
Now, Dr. Tsuji, this table spans across 2 pages, correct?
Yes.
Okay, Mr. Hamburg, could you show us the second page as well? Okay, thank you. Now, Dr. Tsuji, what is this?
So this table summarizes the results of our evaluation of studies using the criteria developed by NTP 2016, and which are very consistent with what you might certainly would want to consider in evaluating developmental neurotoxicity studies in animals. They could have looked at some additional criteria, but those were the main ones. So the shaded portion are studies that had a high risk of bias according to having 3 or more serious risk of bias issues. This was what NTP had done in 2016. And the white area are studies that had 2 or less areas with high risk of bias issues. But because some of these are very serious, like lack of correction for litter effects, just because they only have 1 high risk of bias issue doesn't mean that the study itself doesn't have high risk of bias.
I see McPherson.
I'm sorry.
I see McPherson 2018 listed as study number 1 in this chart. In your declaration, you describe McPherson 2018 as the best conducted recent developmental neurotoxicity study on fluoride. Why is that?
Yes, it is because NTP designed it specifically to address the many tests that have been conducted on fluoride and the poor methods that have been used in many of these tests, and to do a much more thorough job, and also to include exposure levels that would be relevant for community water fluoridation.
Are those the treatment groups you're describing?
Yes. They also included a low dietary fluoride group.
Can you please explain what treatment groups McPherson 2018 used?
So for water, they used 0, 10 milligram per liter, and 20 milligram per liter of fluoride.
And why did McPherson 2018 select those doses?
Because they tend to overestimate, well, they do overestimate community fluoride levels. And I should mention that my declaration, there is an error in a paragraph. I can't remember the number. Is it 42 or where NTP, it produces numbers that indicate that NTP's 20 milligram per liter is closer to a human equivalent fluoridation level than it really is. Actually, that is an error because I used NTP's correction for body weight, and they had an error in it, I've discovered since my declaration. So actually the numbers are much lower. Also, McPherson notes that even if you use the 5 times greater for animals versus humans, if you divide 20 by 5, you get 4 milligram per liter, which is high for the 0.7 milligram per liter goal right now.
What is the relevancy of this error in NTP's calculation with respect to the equivalency to human doses of fluoride?
Well, the doses they used in rodents are certainly much higher than what is currently, people are currently being exposed to in communities.
How many tests did McPherson 2018 perform?
They performed 9 separate neurobehavioral tests. They also conducted clinical tests of the animals, fluoride levels in blood, urine, brain. They looked at histopathology of the brain and other organs, and also looked at thyroid hormone.
What were the overall conclusions of those tests?
Overall, the neurobehavioral tests did not indicate effects on learning and memory.
Now, did McPherson make any conclusions regarding dental fluorosis in the rats studied in that test?
Yes, at 20 milligram per liter, they did see discoloration of the teeth. So the rats were starting to experience that.
And what's the significance, if any, of that finding?
It would suggest that in rats, this study would suggest that in the rats, dental fluorosis is a more sensitive endpoint than effects on learning and memory.
Okay, Dr. Tsuji, I want to now talk about Dr. Thiessen's points of departure and her reference dose calculations. And we can keep Appendix C up because I think this may be helpful. What studies did Dr. Thiessen use to identify points of departure for reference doses?
She used all of these studies, I think with the exception of Zhu et al. 2017 because of had one dose. I'm sorry, I can't pronounce Chinese names. 2018, and Siddharkar, it's an Indian study, 2018, wasn't referenced. And she added Zhang et al. 2014, an earlier study.
And that study, Zhang et al. 2014, is not reflected in this appendix, correct?
No, because it was reviewed in 2016 by NTP.
Now, are the studies that Dr. Thiessen identified reliable for determining points of departure for a risk assessment, in your opinion?
The vast majority of them have serious issues for being confident about magnitude of effect or points of departure, as NTP stated. So even with the more recent literature, I don't think that opinion has changed much. McPherson et al. 2018 calls into question a lot of the earlier findings of positive effects when you use better study methods and larger animal sizes and groups and conduct the tests as they should be.
Now, Dr. Tsuji, did you hear Dr. Thiessen's testimony in this case?
Yes.
And you recall there was some discussion of the Bartos studies?
Yes.
Those are reflected in lines 2 and 3 of your table, correct?
That is correct.
Are those studies reliable for identifying points of departure for a reference dose?
If that's all you had, you would, I don't know, but they certainly have issues because the findings were inconsistent. Bartos 2018 has small animals number per group compared to McPherson. Their control for litter effects, at least they did some, but it wasn't as complete as McPherson. There was no investigator blinding to the outcome mentioned in doing the testing. Also, the inconsistencies of the results call into question whether the findings are chance. Also, the control group was not behaving as one might expect, which NTP 2016 indicated is another risk of bias issue. And some of the differences appear to be because the control group is changing in its behavior.
Dr. Tsuji, did you hear the court's question to Dr. Thiessen about one of the findings in Bartos 2019?
Yes.
Are you able to offer an answer to the court's question on that provision of Bartos 2019?
Yes.
Your Honor, may I show the witness Bartos 2019 and take us back to that paragraph that we were talking about earlier with Dr. Thiessen?
Any objection?
No objection.
Go ahead.
Mr. Hamburg, could you please pull up Bartos 2019, internal reference U81, and show the witness page 7, please. You could focus in on the right side. It is important to highlight. Okay. So, Dr. Tsuji, the court had a question about the first sentence in this paragraph and what it meant. Could you help us out here?
Yes, so the results don't make any sense. So when we see this, we start wondering, is there some kind of internal problem with the study? Because what we have here is the animals are, you see a difference between the 5 milligram per liter, the low dose treatment group, and the control, but you don't see any statistically significant effect when you get higher, which doesn't make any sense. That is not dose response. And one can decide and make up some post hoc reasons why that might be adverse or consistent with some kind of effect, but it is very troubling, and one needs to then consider, given the small animals numbers in each group, the multiple testing or the statistics or the blinding or randomization, how they did the study, it just calls into question that something else might be going on and needs to be investigated.
Your Honor, I'll move on unless you have any further questions about this study.
Nope.
Dr. Tsuji, did you also hear Dr. Thiessen's testimony regarding the application of uncertainty factors?
Yes.
And you're familiar with her trial declaration submitted in this case, also discussing uncertainty factors, is that right?
Yes.
And what's your, could you please summarize for the court your opinion of Dr. Thiessen's application of uncertainty factors in this case?
Your Honor, if I could, I think we may have a disclosure issue here that Dr. Tsuji, in her deposition in this case, expressed. I don't know if the allowance of rebuttal makes that a moot point, but there are disclosure issues if we're going to get into details on uncertainty factors. But if it's fair game for rebuttal, then I'll withdraw the.
It'll be fair game for rebuttal.
Yeah, and I can just clarify that I'm not asking what Dr. Tsuji would do herself, but she has offered an opinion and disclosed an opinion on Dr. Thiessen's application of uncertainty factors.
Yep, go ahead.
Yes, I didn't do the analysis to actually recommend uncertainty factors, but my concern was that there seemed to be no critical scientific evaluation to determine for this chemical specifically how big should they be, and based on these studies. And I've been through that on a number of National Academy committees when we come up with exposure levels, and one should, for each chemical, do a very specific evaluation of the uncertainty factors if you have information.
Now, Dr. Tsuji, based on your review of the National Toxicology Program's 2016 systematic review, your systematic review of the more recent literature published since the NTP's systematic review, and your review of the reports offered by Drs. Thiessen and Grandjean, what is your overall opinion of the neurotoxicity of fluoride?
Well, from what we can see of the animal studies, if there are effects, the most consistent evidence indicates that they are above 20 milligram per liter. It's unclear how much above 20 milligram per liter because we don't have well-conducted tests that above 20 milligram per liter. And we had a NOEL at 20 milligram per liter at a very well-conducted suite of studies. Above 20 milligram per liter, the animals start having various other effects like loss of body weight. It's also, some studies indicate the animals stop drinking the water. It could be that they don't like the taste of the water or the sodium in the water because it's sodium fluoride that they're given. It could be sodium is interacting with them, their physiology somehow, or fluoride's interacting with their physiology. But then you're wondering, is that really a true direct effect on learning and memory? So we have these problems with the animal studies that I'm not sure if we can relate what's happening in them to humans. And also as a result of the evidence published since the 2016 review as well as the 2016 review, the evidence in animals is inadequate to inform our conclusions on neurotoxicity in humans at 0.7 milligram per liter.
I'll pass the witness, Your Honor.
I don't think she fully answered your question because you asked about in light. Did you not ask about in light of the human studies, or were you only asking about the animal studies?
Only with respect to the animal studies.
Oh, okay. I misheard your question. Okay, fine. Thank you.
Well, I should say, to clarify, I asked about neurotoxicity of fluoride, and Dr. Tsuji is a toxicologist who focused on the experimental animal studies.
Right.
She also relied in part on Dr. Chang's opinion regarding the human epidemiological studies, as she states in her trial declaration.
All right, but that's going to be the subject of Dr. Chang's testimony. I think that's more essentially. Okay.
That's correct.
Thank you.
Your Honor, we have about, I guess, a little bit more than 6 minutes left in the day. Would you like us
Is that correct?
You've got 7 minutes left. No.
I'm sorry,
he meant today before we adjourn. And
no, I appreciate that. I thought the trial day went till 2 o'clock Pacific, but maybe I was mistaken.
It's till 1:30 Pacific, but I'd like to, we lost some time this morning. I'd like to utilize it and as much as we can today. So go ahead and commence with your cross, please.
Good afternoon, Doctor.
Oh, good afternoon.
Now, as counsel mentioned, prior to this case, you had not conducted any studies on fluoride.
I have not done any toxicity testing of fluoride, but I have certainly looked at the health risks of fluoride, and I had reviewed the literature on fluoride toxicity.
And you did not consider yourself, prior to this case, to be an expert on fluoride toxicity?
No, prior to this case, in 2008, 2009, neurotoxicity of fluoride was not considered to be a key endpoint in our NAS committee.
But just to be, I'm not sure, maybe you answered my question, but my question was, prior to this case, you did not consider yourself an expert on fluoride neurotoxicity, correct?
That's true, because of the lack of, when I was involved with that committee and with my other projects working on fluoride, there wasn't sufficient evidence that would inform us on neurotoxicity compared to the other endpoints.
So are you saying that you couldn't be an expert on fluoride neurotoxicity because a panel that you worked on in 2009 didn't really investigate that?
Yes, we didn't really consider the neurotoxicity literature because there wasn't sufficient evidence to conclude that it really was a key endpoint compared to the other health effects of fluoride.
So in 2018, when EPA approached you to serve as an expert in this case, you agree with me that you were not an expert on fluoride neurotoxicity at that, correct?
Yes.
You started working for Exponent in 1998, correct?
Yes.
Exponent's a for-profit corporation.
Yes.
How much did Exponent pay you in 2019?
I don't know off the top of my head, and that's company confidential information.
So are you telling me that you cannot provide to the court how much money Exponent paid?
No, I cannot.
Well, I'm going to allow you to submit that information under seal. I understand the sensitivity of that information, but it is relevant information needed for this court's assessment. So I will allow you to submit a declaration so stated, under seal.
Now, at the time of your deposition in this case, Dr. Tsuji, you had already, your team that worked on your report, had already billed EPA over $100,000, correct?
Yes.
And that was back in August of last year, so I assume you've billed EPA some more since then, is that correct?
Yes, I have.
What's the current bill for your report? Not Dr. Chang's report, but your report.
Not my report. We've had several reports in this case, or do you mean my work to date?
Sorry, thank you for the clarification. Yes, your work to date.
Probably about 200,000.
Now, arsenic is one of the key chemicals, Dr. Tsuji, that you have worked on during your time.
I'm sorry, during my time, what?
At Exponent.
At Exponent. Well, let's see. Let me think back. I've had a lot of projects. It's one of the main ones, but there's certainly a lot of others. It's probably half of my publications over the last 25 years.
And most of your work on arsenic has been funded by industry, correct?
Objection, Bate.
Most of the, right, work.
Overruled. Overruled. You can answer if you know.
Most of my work has been funded by my personal time. I'm sorry, did you say my publications, or do you mean my project work?
I'm saying most of your projects
okay,
at Exponent have been funded by industry, correct?
Yeah, I'd say most when you don't know the percentage, but I do have a lot of government projects as well.
And your work on arsenic has been funded in part by mining companies that release arsenic into the environment, correct?
My work has been funded
Well,
by.
Objection Foundation.
Well, why don't you break it down? Has it been funded by mining companies?
Dr. Tsuji, some of your work on arsenic has been funded by mining companies, correct?
Yes, for example, that I've been funded to conduct health risk assessments of metals, and I have been funded to develop lead poisoning prevention programs in communities and biomonitoring programs.
And the mining companies that have retained you to work on arsenic are companies that have faced liabilities for releasing arsenic into the environment.
Yes,
Foundation.
If you know, if she knows.
Yeah, I don't know the extent of their liabilities, but I know they do have to conduct risk assessments and clean up the environment when they have releases that are determined by the regulators that have to be taken care of.
And in addition to the mining companies, you have also been retained by smelting companies for your work on arsenic, correct?
Yes, they, some companies, they mine and smelt. I include both.
And in addition to your work for the smelting companies and the mining companies, your work on arsenic has also been funded by companies that make arsenic-containing treated wood, correct?
Yes, some work, not a large part.
And I am looking here at a 2019 report that you did on arsenic cancer.
A publication?
Yes.
Well, please wait for the question,
Oh, sorry.
Dr. Suji.
And Your Honor, if I could, we've now reached 1:30, and I must say, this is what we consider to be the end of the day. At this point, I would ask that we could go into recess. I was not prepared to go till 2 p.m. today. We've covered a lot of material today. I would just ask the court could recess.
All right. Well, we have reached the 1:30 point, so I will recess for the day. We'll continue with cross on Monday at 8:30. We will continue at that point. And so, Dr. Tsuji, I hope you are available Monday morning to continue this examination.
Thank you. I kept my calendar clear.
Great. Thank you. Thank you. So I just need well, number one, I'd like to hear from Angie what our time expiration looks like.
Your Honor, plaintiffs have 3 hours, 54 minutes, and 10 seconds.
Angie, if I could, does that time estimate include, we had sent to the court the allocation of time for deposition.
It includes the depositions as well.
Yeah.
That have been played.
It's your absolute time left, however you use it.
Right, I'm just, because we had, for the CDC deposition and the deposition of Joyce Donahue, a portion of the designations were from EPA. Has that been allocated out of our time?
No.
Okay, if, Your Honor, we have an agreement by the parties have an agreement that the designations allocated to any given party would be the time spent playing those designations would count against that party.
Yeah.
And so, Angie, I'll go ahead and send that email to you so you have that time allocation.
Right. In other words, you're going to play the whole deposition, but some of it will be charged to one party, some of it will be charged to the other. You want to make sure we charge the right party the right amount.
Yes, Your Honor.
All right. But your base to start with is 3 hours and 54 minutes and 10 seconds. And for the defendants, Angie?
Time remaining for defendants are 3 hours, 50 minutes, and 24 seconds.
All right, we're almost equal there. Okay. All right, good. Well, that hopefully that we're on track to be able to complete. If everybody uses all their time, we'll be able to complete this testimony by Tuesday. And then if I could get the order of witnesses, or at least the witnesses that the government intends to call on Monday.
It will be Joyce Donahue via deposition, and then I believe Ellen Chang, and then Tala Henry.
Okay. And that will, if you get through those, that'll complete the government's case.
Yeah, Your Honor, there's also, we also have some depositions to read into the record from plaintiff's standing declarants.
Okay.
And that's, yeah, so that will be at some point Monday too, where it feels appropriate.
All right. Yep.
On the point of the standing witness depositions, since they're just going to be read, we do have those designations identified in the written discovery Appendix C to the statement. And I'm fine. I mean, EPA ultimately has considerably more designations than we do from that. I have no objection to just entering that testimony into the record without reading it. I'm not quite sure what reading it into the record does, since it's not the witness. There's nothing about credibility, body language, demeanor, anything like that. So I'm fine with allowing EPA to just have that entered into the record and ours entered into the record as well.
Well, are these already, have they already been designated as exhibits?
Yes, Your Honor, they are part of Appendix C, which is the written discovery material that is attached to the pretrial statement.
And how much time does the government expect on the, well, what's your response?
Yeah, we would like to read them into the record, and we expect that'll take about 30 minutes.
All right. I mean, if that's how they want to use their time, they can use their time that way. It's fine.
And for plaintiffs, Your Honor, is it okay if we can just rest on the designations that we've entered into Appendix C without reading?
Well, it's in evidence. That's why I asked the question. It's already in evidence, correct?
Yes.
And the parties are stipulating that it is admissible as evidence.
Well, I don't know about that. I mean, I'm a little confused. I don't know that it's in evidence. It's attached to Appendix C of the joint pretrial statement, but I don't know that the joint pretrial statement is evidence at trial. I mean, it's part of the record, you know, that the court requested for pretrial material, but I don't know that it's actually in evidence.
Well, my question was, there a stipulation that the exhibits, these particular exhibits, would be admissible as evidence?
It's been my understanding, Your Honor, that the what is in Appendix C, which we have entered, which includes interrogatory responses and other materials, is part of the record. And if it's not, then plaintiffs would certainly seek to introduce certainly all of our interrogatory responses that we have identified in Appendix C as evidence, because I just, and I maybe I incorrectly assumed this, Your Honor, but I thought all the interrogatory responses that we identified there are in evidence.
Well, I thought the parties had reached an understanding, and you know, if there's some dispute as to whether an understanding was reached, I guess I'm going to have the parties direct me to where the differences are.
I guess I'm just trying to just clarify for, I'm not sure I'm 100% following. Mr. Condit, are you suggesting that what was attached with Appendix C should be just automatically moved into the trial record here as evidence?
Yes.
Okay, well, I guess that's the question.
Your Honor, is it okay if we take that under advisement and let the court know our position on that on Monday morning?
Why don't you all see if you can reach a stipulation on that? I thought there was a stipulation, but frankly, I didn't look at it to that level of degree. But I'd rather make this clear. We've got to go one way or the other on this. I assume that the plaintiffs are not intending to call as live witnesses the declarants, right?
That is correct, Your Honor.
So why don't you see if you can reach a stipulation, and that might obviate your need. I mean, you can use your time as you want. If you want to read it for emphasis to make sure I period, you can do that. Otherwise, if you stipulate that it be in the record, that might not be that necessity for doing that. So
I understand.
I'll leave it up to you. But meanwhile, we'll plan to hear the testimony as you have laid out on.
Great, thank you.
Could I just have one further point of clarification?
Yeah.
Counsel, it's been my understanding throughout this litigation that the declarations that the plaintiffs, all the experts in this case have written are in evidence in this case and part of their testimony.
That I assume, because that was the whole idea. We were supposed to minimize your need for direct, and we were going to spend most of your time on cross. That one I do recall, and I assume that's how it was submitted. So I am going to treat all of the expert declarations as really in lieu of direct testimony. Of course, now it's been supplemented, but it is in evidence.
Thank you.
Okay. All right. Have a great weekend, everyone.
Thank you too, Your Honor.
See you on Monday.
Court is in recess.
The recording has stopped.
Angie, did you want to hear from us after each day about the exhibits and what's been admitted?
Yes.
Okay, well, plaintiff's counsel isn't here, but according to my notes, today we admitted a document that they had introduced last time. That was Exhibit 47.
Yes.
Yes.
I do think that one is admitted today.
And I think, did we also admit Exhibit 49? Do you have a record of that? Yes. Okay. Of course, we also admitted Joyce Suji's declaration, but that seems like the judge understood that.
Yes, but we also did Exhibit 26.
Oh, yes, Chapter 3. Yes, we did that.
And then, of course, Exhibit 553 was previously admitted on June 4th, document 218.
Yes, 553 was previously.
And then the trial declaration of Dr. Joyce Suji is number 199, and that was admitted.
Number 199.
Those are all that I had. Did you have anything else?
I did not, Mr. Doe. Did you have anything else?
I believe that sounds right, but certainly if not, we will let you know, Angie, and hopefully we'll be able to confer with opposing counsel.
Great. Thank you.
Well, thank you.
Thanks, Angie.
All right. Have a great weekend.
You too.
Hello? You had a question?
Yeah, I just want to say I like this better than court TV, so I just want to make a comment. That's all.
Oh, thank you.
That's all.
Thank you so much. Olamara, you had a question?
Oh, yes, please. Thank you so much for making this publicly available.
Oh, you're welcome.
And you mentioned the other day that we should contact Deborah Pass toward getting a copy of the recordings.
Correct. I'm sorry?
How can we contact her?
Oh, if you can go on our website, www.cand.uscourts.gov, and click on Court Reporters Transcripts. Her name will be on that list.
Excellent. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.